Well, it's a real, it's an honor and a thrill and kind of a neat chance to introduce my older brother, Paul. For all of our lives, I'm 16 months younger than he is, and so he's always been my big brother. Not only, or not actually in stature, but in age and knowledge for sure. He's been my big brother, and it's been a tough act to follow, let me tell you, growing up after a guy like this. But it's been, I'm really so happy to have him come here and to introduce you all to him and him to you. And I asked him to come and talk about the kind of things that he's interested in. And so I said, come and talk about science and mathematics and God. And so let me tell you a little bit why I thought each of those three things fit for Paul. Paul has always been interested in science. From the time, as I say, when I was a little kid, he'd always be explaining something to me. And sometimes his explanations got pretty technical. And I hope it doesn't get that way today. But even just last night, I picked him up at the Grand Rapids Airport, and we were driving down. Paul noticed the moon, and then he started talking about a colleague of his, a former Jesuit named Clavius, who was over 400 years ago looked at an eclipse of the moon, and Paul was telling me how he used his mathematics to determine the diameter of the sun, and it got pretty technical, and I just kept nodding my head. So he's always been interested in science and told us a lot about science. The second part of it is mathematics. And Paul, when he graduated from Holy Cross, had decided to enter the Society of Jesus to become a priest. But his advisor said, you know, Paul, you have a chance to go to Princeton and finish your PhD. So that's what he did. He went to Princeton, and he was at the Institute for Advanced Studies there and got his PhD in algebraic topology under Professor Steenrod, the eminent topologist, who maybe nobody here has heard of. But so Paul, and since then, he literally is an internationally known mathematician. He's presented in all the continents except Australia, has been given papers at over 100 different professional societies, has what's the word? Anyway, he has lots of his doctoral students that are following along, and he's just retired now as a professor at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. And so, but the third part of it is God. And as I said, Paul is a member of the Society of Jesus. And so after he finished his PhD and did a year's postdoc, he entered the society and moved very quickly, much faster than they usually do, and was ordained in 1970. And so he's a priest, Catholic priest, a member of the Society of Jesus. And so he knows so much about all three of these topics, and so I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And so I want to introduce my brother, Father, Dr. Brother Paul Schweitzer.
Well, I'd like to thank Rex and also my younger brother, my little brother, John, for this lovely introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be able to be here with you and to share some reflections. Perhaps it's worth spending a moment to tell how some of these things came about. A little over a year and a half ago, I received a request from another Jesuit priest who had, John Pitteret, who had been the president of Loyola University in Chicago for about 10 years. And when he retired, he started working in Catholic education, trying to develop things that would help the Catholic education to fulfill its purpose. And he asked me to contribute a chapter on mathematics to a book to be published by Oxford University Press in the next few months about the Catholic intellectual tradition. Of course, my first reaction was, what is there mathematics in the Catholic intellectual tradition? But then I went reflecting and thinking for several months and gradually came up with some points that were relevant and wrote a chapter which is called Mathematics and Reality and God. So that was one thing. Another thing is I belong to a group which is called the Clavius group. It's a group of mathematicians that are Catholics. There's no such thing as Catholic mathematics unless you put a small c in, then it maybe it's okay. But there are Catholic mathematicians, and we've been getting together. The group got started in 1963, so next summer will be the 50th meeting of this group. Of course, the generations are passing. Clavius, Christopher Clavius, was a Jesuit from the early times of the Society of Jesus, as John mentioned. He was a respected scientist, and it was he who, when many academicians of that time didn't accept the discoveries of Galileo, it was he who had a telescope constructed, looked through it, and said, Galileo is right. What he is observing is true. It's not just a defect in the lens of his telescope, as many people were asserting. But Clavius, next year will be the 400th anniversary of his death, and there'll be a number of different commemorations. I should mention about the eclipse what was interesting. The point was that this particular total eclipse that occurred was one that was just on the borderline between a total eclipse in which you can see nothing of the sun and what's called an annular eclipse in which you can see a little halo of the sun's disk. So what this means is that from the point of view on the Earth that Clavius was observing, the angle of the moon and the angle of the sun were exactly the same. And an astronomer in Rome who is making studies of the variation in the size of the sun has used this to discover the difference in the diameter of the sun over the last 400 years. Actually, there's been a significant change, something like 0.5%. Well, let me go on to my talk then. I would like to show you some things that seem to me to be interesting about mathematics, reality, and God, and the sciences too. So how can we discern traces of God's work in the world? The first thing I would suggest is in beauty. Beauty in nature is a sign of God's love and goodness. And when we look at the profligate beauty of the natural world, I think it's very difficult to try to explain that by the Darwinian theory of evolution. I mean, certainly we know that many, many things of our existence come just from the adaptations that are favorable to survival. But I can't really find any way to realize that such an enormous amount of beauty in the world would fit into that and our appreciation of it. Well, that's what I'm just saying. This abundant and extraordinary beauty of the world around us is, I think, a gratuitous gift from God. Now I'd like to talk a bit about mathematics. For me, it reflects the presence and the action of God because there is much beauty in mathematics. I'm going to talk a lot about that today. Mathematics has a relationship with religious art, obviously, and we'll see a little bit of that. And maybe we can think of mathematical theories and objects as somehow being situated in the mind of God. By the way, I would like to say that if anyone wants to comment or interrupt or make a question or suggest something, please feel free. This should be informal. I don't want it to be just a lecture. Another trace of God's action I'd like to mention today is called the anthropic principle. We'll get back to that later on. But this is the basic idea. The physical universe and the laws of nature show amazing coincidences. Coincidences that make life and the evolution of intelligent life possible. If it weren't for these strange coincidences, it would be impossible for us to be here. And that's why the principle is anthropic principle. And this fact is widely recognized by physicists and astronomers. About 50 years ago, when it was first suggested, it was met with a lot of disagreement, and people didn't accept it. but nowadays it is accepted very broadly. The question what's in question nowadays is how you interpret this anthropic principle.